It is the meeting place of the tangible and the intangible. Amid the beauty of Persepolis, as within the splendid palaces of Sumer and Babylon, there certainly was music some 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. Unfortunately, no trace of its notation survives. Recently, the Syrian musician Abed Azrieh recreated from the oldest descriptions and the most ancient living musical traditions of the Middle East a setting for the epic legend of King Gilgamesh, regarded as a half-god, and his pagan friend Enkidu. This is his conception of what that music might have sounded like in those remote times. وعلى ألواح من حجر دون ما فعله وما رآه. How enthralling it is to trace music so far back with its magical properties lending added grandeur to legends. Some instruments were considered so sacred that their very construction was kept secret even from the eyes of kings. This harp from Ur, carefully reconstructed, is the oldest surviving instrument of the string family, dating to 5000 BC. Over 5,000 years ago in China, Japan, and other parts of the Far East, music had become a fully developed and refined art. In the 7th century BC, the Chinese poet Lili Kim wrote, "Virtue is our favorite flower. Music is the perfume of that flower." The Japanese koto is another instrument whose origins can be traced far back to the Chinese chin in use before 2000 BC. Both are still in current use, and their music is built around the interval of the fifth. It would seem that the Chinese were the first to establish the circle of fifths, advancing that very same theory later discovered by Pythagoras, who was unaware of Chinese musical theory. The interval of the fifth is no doubt the most important one in most of the music of the world. It was considered magical, for it reflected the number 3. It is the first new sound in the row of overtones. And by building new sounds upon others, you establish a row of fifths, which is still the way all string instruments are tuned. I will give you an example. As tuned on the violin, G, D, A, E. And if I had a fifth string, it would be tuned B. Now, when these 5 notes are put within the compass of 1 octave, these are the notes that you will hear, which is none other than the basic pentatonic scale the Chinese adopted many, many thousands of years ago. The pentatonic scale is a series of 5 notes, to which the Chinese later did add 2 more, forming the 7-note series we call a major scale. Yet so sacred was the 5-note scale that it was preserved for use in spiritual or religious music. It is a curious thought that this scale was considered sacred because it is so pure, so clean, having no inbuilt contradictions, and therefore no need of any resolutions. All the intervals are interrelated and strong, built up as they are from the 1/5. However, the people who danced and sang spontaneously always wanted scales which would be more interesting, more tantalizing, and which the church for thousands of years, whether it was the Chaldean, the Samaritan, or the Jewish, did its best to avoid and ban. The Catholic Church banned this interval, which is known as the triton. It's the nearest to the fifth and would resolve, but it can also resolve. And this ambiguity of resolution into two completely different keys was what made it be considered as an instrument of the devil. It was called the diabolus, and therefore it was excluded. As long as people remained with the pentatonic scale, there was no danger. All civilizations have had their scales and their modes. For the Chinese, music and ethics were a unity. Confucius wrote, "When music leads the people's minds toward the right ideals and aspirations, we may see the emergence of a great nation." From one end of the earth to the other, over the ages, musicians have enjoyed trying to evoke and imitate the sounds of nature, especially those heavenly singers, the birds in the sky. But our music is more than the sounds of nature. It is a living structure. I've often thought that the very simplest musical form resembles a leaf folded upon itself, two halves like our body, a simple repetition. But then, music being a modeling of time, we require memory, for how can we repeat unless we remember? And with these simple elements, we can begin to build. A plus A, and our classical music consists of hardly more than two halves repeating each. And then, gradually, we began to fill in the middle, fill the form with enormous developments, as Beethoven did. And then, if you wish to compose a melody, you would first have to have a natural rhythmic pulse. And the simplest rhythmic pattern you can think of is ram, pa-pum, pa-pum, pa-pum. Then we've had our pentatonic scale, a succession of notes, which you've heard, ra-ra-ra-ra-reem. And if you're in the proper mood and feel tender about it, you would possibly sing ram ti-tim ta-tam ti-tim ta-tim ta-tim ta-tam, which you all know. Surely no ancient civilization held music to be more important to its moral and aesthetic life than did that of classical Greece. Of all the glorious sights, none evokes that time more powerfully than the place to which thousands of pilgrims came every year, the temple of Apollo raised high up on Mount Parnassus at Delphi. You are hearing the hymn to Apollo, probably the oldest surviving fragment of ancient notated music in the world. This music was of such significance that it was inscribed in letter notation on this stone from Delphi some 2,500 years ago. You can just see the notes right above the words. The ancient Greeks knew man in his wholeness, for they understood and embodied and gave due respect to the duality of his nature, the one side striving towards clarity, moderation, and temperance, the other driven towards the fantastic and the orgiastic. The light and the spirit of man were embodied in Apollo, god of music. both art and science. The dark and visceral side of man by Dionysus, god of those ecstatic, intoxicating urges that took their particular form of more sensual expression in a different kind of poetry and dance, and, I'm convinced, in a chromatic